Well, we're on the show today to talk a little bit about fatherhood and modern society. And I want to pose a question to you. What is fatherhood to you, and what are the pillars of fatherhood?
Fatherhood to me, if I had to sum it up one word, I think it's sacrifice. For me, it's always just been about putting my children first and myself last, even if that means sometimes my body. And I come from that from the standpoint of I'm a half blue collar, half white collar, even though, you introduced me as an architect. I'm also a general contractor and a carpenter, essentially. So, like this building that I'm sitting in, for instance, right now, it was our real estate development. And there was a point where I worked for 80 days straight. I did kind of take a break for right in the middle of that, but that was because I just got too sick to actually even get out of bed that day. So, and then I can remember even when going back to from 2012 to 2015, there was a 3-year stint. I'm remarried now, but my former wife, now ex-wife, she actually abandoned us for like 3 years. She went all the way up to North Dakota, up to North Dakota. Moved from Colorado, and I was on my own completely. And in 2013, during those years, like that was still very much startup phase for the company, for my primary company, and we weren't really making any money. I mean, we were just making enough to pay ourselves a salary to basically eat, but it was very much paycheck to paycheck, trying to keep 2 kids in private school, stuff like that. So for me, it's always just been about sacrifice. And I think and I look at my dad, I actually have 2 dads. I found my real dad when I was 33, I'm 40 now. But the dad who raised me, it's just always been about sacrifice. And I think that's one of the things I took from him is like, your kids come first before anything. Because that's your legacy, that's your seed for the future, and all of that. And I think a man needs to be stoic about that situation. And I don't mean from the standpoint of, I think one of the myths that I dispelled for myself last summer after I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was Stoicism is not about just, if this was called the Stoic Podcast, you and I would not be just looking at each other and not saying a word. It's not that sort of cartoony thing. It's about understanding your place at any given moment in time in the universe. And then what are your chess moves from there? And what do you got to do to keep putting food on the table, to keep protecting them, to keep providing for them, and doing all of those things?
Wonderful answer. So out of these 3, which of the following defines fatherhood the best? Supporter, creator, provider?
I would have to say provider, because I think that's probably just on the heels of my last answer that I gave you is, it's what you just do everything it takes. And obviously, like every generation does this, right? Is, the great generation, they wanted to make sure that the boomers, who they bore everybody, that they had a better life than they had. And then, the millennials, and then, our Gen X and the millennials, and then Gen Z and everything like that. So like for me specifically, I grew up in a very lower middle class house. Dad worked on the farm, and that's where his sacrifice came in for us. Was he could have went off on his own, but he really was tied to his dad in such a way that like the only thing he could really get any kind of recognition for was if he sacrificed and said, hey, I'm not going to go off and go work in the oil fields up in North Dakota or start a logging company. And these are all things that he could have done and did do a little bit. Start his own construction company, anything like that. Like his sacrifice was for just stability of trying to keep the family farm going in that kind of way, and then thus provide for us. So, he didn't make a lot of money at all. He only worked for like six months out of the year, 8 months out of the year. And then there was a huge layoff in the winter every time. His dad never let him get cattle, and he wanted to do that. And my mom has worked the same job since she was, for about 40 years now, dental assistant. And then the area I grew up in was like a town of 500 people, graduated with a class of only 20. And then, so in that environment, it was also on basically an Indian reservation. So I'm a federally registered Native American, technically a minority and stuff like that. So I never wanted my children to have to experience just the anxiety of not having money. Like one of my favorite quotes is by Ye, and it's Kanye West. For everybody doesn't know who that is having money isn't everything, but not having it is. And for me, it's not about like possessions. It's about, I want my children to be able to come to me and say, because this happened to me. It was like, there was one summer I will never forget. My mom, she only gave us, like, me a pair of Aqua socks. And does anybody, if you're a 90s kid, you remember that. If you're a millennial, remember that. I think they still make them. But like, that was the only pair of shoes I got that summer. And I just completely wore them out. And I remember playing a football game with some of my cousins and friends at the end of the summer, and like getting made fun of because they were like falling off and stuff. And I was just too afraid, because I would overhear mom and dad talking and worrying about money so much to even ask for stuff like that. So that's the thing I've tried to always explain to my children, is like, dad will always be here for you in almost every capacity, but especially as a provider. And you know what I've been thinking lately about like their future? So full disclosure, I have 2 stepchildren and 2 biological children. The oldest 2, there's 3 boys, 1 girl. The oldest 2 are 18. One's out in college. One's about to graduate high school. And then a 15-year-old son and a 13-year-old girl. And as they've gotten to this age, I think the thing that I've now been thinking about is what kind of anxiety can I alleviate from them and try to encourage them to start families. And I think for that, it's like, hey guys, if you guys stay in Colorado, I will stay in Colorado. Like, what about us sticking together? Because I moved from North Dakota, so I had no support. And that was my own decision. I mean, I had to do that as trying to be an architect, because there's just not a lot of architecture up in North Dakota. No offense, it just is what it is. It's just very utilitarian style buildings, if you know what I mean, like shops and typical box houses and stuff like that. And then the other caveat I've been thinking about just telling them, and I might even do it this Sunday after church, is like, because we have a breakfast every time or dinner or something like that, is, hey guys, like, I will be here. I'm trying to put myself in a financial position to where, like, instead of sending the kids to daycare, like, you could just send them with me and grandma during the day. So I've just knowing the lessons I learned from being that single dad and not having that support system, and knowing the anxiety, like, if I would have been told that from my mom and dad, if they would have said, you know what, Lance, we want you to have a big family. We want you to have, like, we don't want you to base your decisions on only having 2 children on the idea that that you have this anxiety about you can't afford them or whatever. Like, if your desire is to have 4, 5, 6, 8 kids or whatever, then we want to facilitate that, because they wanted more grandkids. Well, I didn't really have that support system. So that's sort of I didn't even expect to say that today, but I think that's kind of where my head is at when I think about that word provider in its totality.